You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. China and Britain have been embroiled in a low-level diplomatic tussle this week over one of Beijing's perennial bugbears, the Dalai Lama. The exiled Tibetan Buddhist leader is visiting the UK, and China wants to ensure he doesn't get red carpet treatment. China even threatened to withdraw its pre-Olympic training camp from Leeds over the northern city hosting a speech from His Holiness. Chinese officials have snubbed British delegates during trips to Beijing since May, when Prime Minister David Cameron met with the Dalai Lama. Beijing has ruled Tibet since 1950, considers the Dalai Lama a separatist, and warns other countries against interfering in its domestic affairs. Chinese anger at foreign interference used to be easier to brush off, but now its defense spending grows by 12% a year and its economy by a recession-defying 8% this year. Territorial disputes with the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia and Taiwan across the South China Sea frequently flare up into standoffs, and the United States is currently pivoting towards the Asia-Pacific in what Beijing think tanks see as a containment policy. So, has China's growing power silenced Britain over the Dalai Lama's visit? How is China's rise perceived from Taiwan and the other countries with which it has territorial disputes? And what predictions can we make about the American pivot towards the region? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studios. I'm joined by Rod Wye from the foreign policy think tank Chatham House, Patrick Hayes, a commentator for Spite magazine, Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College London, and Andrew Leung, an independent China specialist over the line from Hong Kong. First of all, to you, Rod, in the studio, what do you make over the Dalai Lama's visit and the standoff between Beijing and London over this one?
Well, there's a common pattern to this. China regularly objects to any governments allowing the Dalai Lama to visit their country, and particularly it objects to meetings between politicians and the Dalai Lama. And there is a period of Chinese outrage. We have seen increasingly China taking sanctions of various sorts against the countries concerned, and then after a while, relations get back to normal.
And do you think there's anything changing in this dynamic now? For example, is the UK having to listen more to China because it has more economic weight? There have been a number of trade delegations from London travelling out to Beijing, and they've had their ministerial level meetings downgraded. Is the UK missing out on trade because we have to have our officials meeting the Dalai Lama?
I think probably not. I mean, China's sanctions are usually carefully targeted so that they hurt the pride of the country concerned, but don't hurt China's real interests. And China does have significant interests in continuing trade with UK and with Europe, especially at this moment when both China's economy and the European economy are not doing as well as they had once done.
I'd like to get opinions from the other speakers here on this issue, but maybe, Andrew, in Hong Kong, can you explain from maybe even as far back as 1950 how the Tibet situation came about and why it is so crucial from Beijing's point of view?
It went back very, very long time, way before communists took power. You've got to go back really to the Qing dynasty and beyond, because during the past, there was a lot of the linkages, but influence from Beijing, including certain periods where certain local senior officials, their appointment had to be sanctioned by the imperial court. So going back a long, long history, that sustains China's claim that, in fact, Tibet has always been, for a very, very long time at least, part of China. And that is not just Beijing. If you ask any Chinese people, that's the majority view of the vast majority view of the Chinese people. In fact, I would say all of the Chinese people.
The Dalai Lama comes over to the UK and he talks and he gives speeches to young children and talks about spiritual values, what would largely be considered good things. Why is it that the perspective of him from Beijing is this separatist threat?
There have been a lot of discussions between the Dalai Lama with the Beijing authorities. With the increasing international involvement with this issue, and a lot of the Western countries, not all of them, see Tibet in the same vein as the Chinese government or in fact the Chinese people. And if you look at the international media, at the English press, there was a lot of talk about Tibet was seized by the communists when they took power. It has never been part of China. And in fact, during the Olympics, for example, the Chinese Olympics, when it was held in Beijing, there was a lot of protest. And so China was extremely anxious that this is not being seized and to create a movement against the separation of Tibet from China.
Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College London, is it legitimate, do you think, for Beijing to use its diplomatic muscle in this case, threatening to withdraw its pre-Olympic training camp from Leeds if that city doesn't put pressure to stop the Dalai Lama speaking?
There is a pattern to these disputes between China and other countries when it comes to the Dalai Lama. So Beijing threatens with some diplomatic punishment or even economic punishment, but after a few months this is forgotten. But to an extent, Beijing has to make this point that the Communist Party has to show its strength on this particular issue to the Chinese population, because the Chinese population actually supports this stance from the Chinese government. So I wouldn't say this is only about domestic politics, but certainly domestic politics are important to understand the position that Chinese leaders have to take in this particular case.
Ramon and Rod, are you saying the same thing? Are you saying that it's just a bit of diplomatic theatre that Beijing has to do and we have to do? Politicians from both sides know that they're doing it and everyone knows that it doesn't really matter?
It does matter to Beijing. I mean, Ramon is absolutely right. It matters hugely to Beijing. This is a matter of what the Chinese term one of their core interests, Tibet, that their rule is maintained in Tibet. And of course, we have seen in the last few months an increasing number of people in Tibet setting themselves on fire in protest at the behavior of the Chinese authorities, and in particular their rejection of the Dalai Lama. So there is a large internal aspect to it. In addition to that, of course, China is going through a big period of leadership change, so it is especially sensitive to both domestic and international political issues. And thirdly, you're right, China is bigger, China is more important, and feels that its concerns should be taken more seriously by the world.
Patrick Hayes.
I think that's one of the reasons why Alex Salmons, the Scottish First Minister, has actually said that he might not meet with the Dalai Lama, despite being under quite a lot of pressure to do so. I mean, England still has the clout to resist Beijing to a certain extent, but I think smaller countries might not.
You mean a potentially independent Scotland in the future? Is he planning down the line for this one?
I suspect he's thinking very carefully about that and will be doubtless be turning to Chinese support at some point, so doesn't want to damage diplomatic relations there. Now, I think Beijing was wrong in terms of heaping the pressure onto Leeds City Council to try and ban the Dalai Lama. I think he had every right to prance about, as he did do with the comedian Russell Brand at this international business conference, and I don't think it should be the business of China whether or not he does that or not. But I do understand the sensitivity around China, because I think the Dalai Lama is used by a lot of Western governments for what we at Spikes call China bashing. Because I think increasingly the Dalai Lama is used as a bit of a battering ram by Western governments. And I think what we're seeing an emerging culture war with China. And I'm concerned about that, because I think the reason why he's flattered by world governments and allegedly has been bankrolled by the CIA from the 50s to the 70s is not because these Western institutions, care very dearly for democratic future or liberty in Tibet, but rather that I think they want to ratchet up international pressure for their new competitors in world politics, the Chinese. Now, I'm not a defender in any way of the authoritarian regime in Beijing, but I think it's important to see that such global sabre rattling is actually more likely to entrench divisions between the Tibetan people and China and increase instability in world affairs, rather than actually herald anything like a new era of freedom in the East. This using the Dalai Lama as a kind of battering ram to engage in China bashing, to try and score points in this new culture war with a rising kind of economic star, could actually be causing problems in Tibet for any kind of future of democracy.
Andrew, can I put that one to you? Is there any truth in the claim that the Dalai Lama is some kind of political pawn of the West being used to poke at Beijing?
If you look at all the Western media and also in diplomatic exchanges surrounding visits of the Dalai Lama, the feeling of the Beijing leadership is definitely that is being used as a pawn, and that explains China's sensitivity over this issue. But then, as I was just saying, China has to make this as a matter of principle as far as the external treatment of the Dalai Lama is concerned. But inside Tibet, what's happening in Tibet is over the past centuries, the Tibetan people, of course, have experienced tremendous rise in standards of living in terms of life expectancy, in terms terms of access of education. And if you look at the Dalai Lama regime in the past, all the Tibetan people were actually had no rights. All the people were regarded as chattels of the Dalai Lama regime. But then I'm not defending, of course, China's treatment of the Tibetan issue. Obviously, there was a lot to be learned. But on the one hand, there is no doubt that economic development of Tibet has been increasing dramatically. But on the other hand, it's a question of the feeling of the Tibetan people that somehow the Han Chinese are overwhelming the local economy because they are better connected, because they have more connections out of business and with the governments. So there's a feeling of being shortchanged, as it were, by this kind of economic policies of China. The last thing China wants is for foreign governments to be involved and even giving support to the Dalai Lama regime, as it were.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at China's growing economic and military clout. I'm joined by Rod Wai from the foreign policy think tank Chatham House, Patrick Hayes, a commentator for Spiked magazine, Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College London, and over the line from Hong Kong by Andrew Long, an independent China specialist. Rod, I want to put that one to you. In your opinion, how should the UK respond to Chinese pressure on this issue?
Just to go back a bit, first of all, I don't think that there are any foreign governments that deny that Tibet is part of China. All foreign governments now accept that position, and the British government itself changed to that position a few years ago. So there is no real question about foreign governments are somehow supporting splitism or supporting separatism in Tibet by receiving the Dalai Lama. That is simply not the case. They do not support independence or anything like that for Tibet and have said so frequently. But there is a real problem about the treatment of the Tibetan people in Tibet. And yes, Andrew is right. There has been substantial economic development in Tibet, but the Chinese have not won the question of hearts and minds. When most of the monasteries in Tibet still have work teams from the Chinese government ensuring that monks behave in a politically correct fashion, when protests continue even under a very harsh crackdown by the Chinese security authorities in Tibet, it is clear that there is still something that the Chinese need to do to win the hearts and minds of the Tibetan people. And I think that is one of the crucial issues here. As far as the UK government is concerned and standing up to China over Tibet, first of all, as I said, there is no question of seeking separatism or a separate or independence for Tibet. What there is a question of is asking the Chinese government to treat the Tibetan people properly and fairly and to respect their culture and traditions.
Ramon, do you have anything to add to that?
It is true that hearts and the minds of the Tibetan people haven't been won by the Chinese government. I don't think this is exceptional and only happens in China. We do see in other countries, even European countries, in which there are certain regions that want to become independent, even though they have been together for hundreds of years. So I don't think this is a problem that only the Chinese government has. However, it is true that within Tibet you have quite distinct culture that has developed over hundreds of years, basically over the past few centuries. And maybe you have seen an awakening when people have achieved a more comfortable standard of living. There has been a cultural awakening that maybe wasn't there when there was this oppression of the Tibetan people by the monks that we were talking about before. So in a sense, what I do see here is that to win the hearts and the minds of the Tibetan people, maybe the Chinese government should change the approaches. It has tried to do the same, for example, in Inner Mongolia, tried to change the approach towards the population in this particular region, a little bit in Xinjiang as well, but it seems that in Tibet, perhaps because the profile of the Tibetan case is much bigger, the Chinese government is yet to try to change another approach, to try to get Tibetan people or the people living in Tibet to feel more Chinese or more integrated with the rest of the population.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at China's growing economic and military clout. I'm joined by Rod Wai from the foreign policy think tank Chatham House, Patrick Hayes, a commentator for Spiked magazine, Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College London, and over the line from Hong Kong by Andrew Long, an independent China specialist. Andrew, turning back to you at the moment because you're in the region. We've just been talking there about China's relationships with the UK and how its diplomatic might is stretching this far, but obviously it's stronger in the region. We're continuing to hear reports of flare-ups between fishing vessels and Coast Guard ships in the South China Sea, where China has territorial disputes with the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia and Taiwan. Can you give us a sketch of what's happening there?
All these territorial disputes have been on the cards for a long, long time, and it's only during the past couple of years that this tension has been rising. This has been rising particularly in the recent months as a result of America's repositioning itself to the Asia Pacific, especially following the withdrawal from Afghanistan, from the Middle East. In the wake of the financial crisis, of course, the capacity for America to act as the world's policeman has been declining. The leadership is still there, but the capacity is diminished. So America is now refocusing its resources to theaters of strategic interest to America, and the Asia Pacific is on top of the list. Now, this, of course, translates into increased military presence and military ties, military exercises with a lot of countries in the region. Several of them have territorial disputes in China, and these countries have now been emboldened to exert their claims. Now, of course, territorial integrity sits at the very heart of China's core interests. That covers, of course, Taiwan, but it also covers a number of the islands with strategic interest to China, not only because they have hidden mineral resources beneath the sea, but also because they scattered in a very vital sea lane for the import of essential energies and minerals to fuel China's industrialization and urbanization. So this is really, the South China Sea really controls China's lifeblood. And that's why they're so sensitive to China, and that's why China is seen to be projecting its military deterrence in the area. This is a classic security dilemma with negative looks on both sides between China and America, in fact, with the regional neighbors.
Patrick, I'm going to turn to you there. Andrew was just talking about the American pivot, the repositioning of its forces to the Asia-Pacific, moving to station 60% of its battleships in the region, up from about 50% now, while maintaining 6 aircraft carriers in the region. Washington says this is not about containing China. How do you see it?
Well, I think it's true that China's significance, both as an economic world power, but also increasingly as a political power on the world stage, is increasing, and America is feeling threatened by that and is repositioning its forces along those lines. But I mean, I think this also speaks to a certain anxiety in the West, in America in particular, about a lack of growth here, a lack of economic opportunities, which have effectively, over the last 20 years or so, been outsourced to Eastern countries, to China. We've seen a massive kind of outsourcing of productive activity from the West, from Britain, from America and other large economies to talk about some kind of post-industrial society, and China has taken full advantage of that. I mean, to the extent that we talk about, China intervening in other countries or starting to make territorial claims. I mean, look, for example, at their, they're now buying up large swathes of North Australia. They're having a massive impact and actually developing very strong diplomatic relations in Africa through investing in infrastructure there and buying mineral rights there. I mean, China is playing a very large role in the development of the productive capacity of the world economy now, and you can understand why America is being threatened by that. But I think they need to ask some more kind of serious questions about how to actually go back to having a more productive economy rather than just trying to show military muscle, because ultimately that will not amount in anything progressive for America. They'll just be managing their decline on the world stage.
Rod, can I put that one to you? Is that true, what Patrick was saying about America, that this movement of military force is an expression of anxiety and economic impotence?
I think we tend to get sort of blinded by the sort of headline nature of movements of military forces. Yes, they have a significance, but they're not that significant. And I think Patrick is right that the really important issues at the moment are economic related issues. And they are both domestic for China and the United States, and they are international in the sense that we all live in a global economy, and we need to manage that global economy better. And that means China and the United States working more successfully together, including Europe, on the management of the world economy, because we sink or swim together, basically. There isn't a way of one lot winning out over the other. So I think Patrick is absolutely right to put the emphasis on the economic issues. I think, of course, we need to pay attention to security issues, but there isn't going to be a war between China and the United States. Neither the Chinese nor the United States seriously believe that. So we shouldn't overinterpret military maneuvers. There will be questions, and there are questions, of China's relationship with its smaller neighbors in the region, and just because one country is bigger doesn't necessarily mean that it is right in terms of the complex territorial disputes disputes in the South China Sea, but those will have to find some kind of solution, and that will have to be worked by China with the other parties, either collectively or individually. And until that time, we're going to see continued scrapping because they are important. The maritime sea lanes, possible mineral resources, fishery resources, all these things are in short supply and of crucial importance to all the countries concerned.
On the issue of whether or not there could be any military crisis between the US and China, you look at some of the defense spending that China has been involved in, investing heavily in these asymmetric capabilities, land-based ballistic and cruise missiles, modern jets with anti-ship missiles, and in particular, one that's being talked about a lot in defense fairs is this Carrier Killer, a new ballistic missile that's said to be maneuverable and able to take out and land on the deck of an aircraft carrier almost 3,000 kilometers out at sea. Surely that is aimed at some kind of deterrence of America's military involvement in the region and its possible defense of Taiwan.
Taiwan is an unlikely contingency. You're absolutely right that is the one place where one can see a sequence of events that might lead to some form of conflict between China and the United States. But then step back from that. Can you really imagine leaders of China and of the United States saying, we are going to unleash all we have got on each other over this particular issue? It would be disastrous for all concerned, whoever came out better in the event of such a conflict. And it is the business of diplomats and politicians to find ways through those conflicts. It's the business of military men to prepare and to find ways of dealing with potential conflicts or potential military challenges. Both things are going to go on together. That's the world we live in.
Ramon, I'll put that one to you. We shouldn't necessarily be looking so much at the military, but we should keep an eye on the economy more.
We focus on Chinese military expenditure, but China is not the only country that is spending increasingly on its military. In the region, we see the same with South Korea, we see the same with Vietnam, the Philippines, so different countries in the region spending more on their military. And in a sense, the Chinese military technologically still has a long way to go to match the US, but even to match the Japanese or the South Korean military. So in a sense, I think the expenditure is going to be carrying on because China obviously wants to have a stronger military. But as other speakers have said, China needs to focus on its economy, and it has to focus on the fact that it is still a long way of being a developed country. And if it wants to have a stability within its border, it needs to develop its own economy. And even though we focus on this expenditure on the military, we do see that China is spending much more on other areas of the economy, is implementing new reforms. Now, for example, is tinkering with its own financial system. So I think the military usually attracts a lot of headlines when it comes to China. But first of all, I don't think this is exceptional in East Asia. I don't think this is anything that other countries are not doing in the region. And secondly, I think that China is still focusing much more on economic development, and for the time being, China will have to focus on this economic development.
Andrew Leung.
I think that's definitely economics are important. Economy is important, as China is now the second largest economy in the world and is set to overtake the United States within a couple of decades. But I think there's more that is on the table. And if you look beneath the surface, in fact, we are seeing the rise of a world power. This, in case of China, seen by America as the challenger to its world leadership or dominance. And this is playing out in the South China Sea because that is a very vital theater. As I mentioned, that this is, controls the very lifeblood of China, including a lot of territories, territorial disputes, right at the core of China's core interests. And so this is a grand game going on between China and the United States. And China, of course, is no match for America's overwhelming naval power, and that's why China has to develop all these asymmetric deterrents, particularly to protect her core interests over Taiwan, as it were. Our colleagues are right, and there is no America would have no wish to trigger a kind of regional, if not world war, over Taiwan. Neither would China, but China would have no alternative if Taiwan is seen to be veering towards independence. No Communist Party leaders could stand the kind of political backlash inside China, particularly from the Chinese people, because territorial integrity is at the very heart of China's very bitter history in the past. Don't forget the foreign incursions or aggressions or occupations of China during the past 200 years. Now, this does not mean that both sides would inevitably confront each other over a looming Cold War, if not a hot war. But I think that what America wants to see is this peace and stability in the South China Sea, and America is trying to do this by beefing up the kind of military capabilities of all these countries. Now, Taiwan, of course, is a sticking point. But if Taiwan, in the eyes of America, if Taiwan should fall, not that it would make China stronger. It's not just that. It's because that would be send the fear through all the neighboring countries of China in the South China Sea or the East China Sea and all the way to the Indian Ocean. And so that affects America's core strategic interests as well, is geopolitics. So while economics are important, I think we need to see beneath the surface a lot of the geopolitics, the undercurrents are going on, and hopefully those undercurrents will be better managed by both sides, America and China.
Patrick Hayes.
To finish off, I just wanted to return back to the UK and look at the situation here. I think you can do that with the tale of the two Olympics. If you go back to Beijing Olympics in 2008, what you saw there were, almost unforgettable. The drummers there, in the opening ceremony, the drummers, the spectacle. This was China arriving on the world stage and paying no expense in terms of kind of making an announcement to the world. Last week it was announced what the UK Olympics opening ceremony was going to be, and the director Danny Boyle said, we can't possibly compete with China. What we need to do is present Britain as this natural place that's recovering from its economic legacy. And I think that actually speaks to an attitude in the West now. So basically the Olympics opening ceremony here compared to China is going to be green and pleasant lands. It's going to be a recreation of Glastonbury with farm animals. And I think this speaks to a kind of almost a giving up economically in terms of competing, especially in the UK. I think the US are learning that they're no longer going to be the number one superpower on the block and have to play kind of geopolitical relations more and more with China in these kind of situations. But we're looking at the management of the decline economically of previously very influential Western economic powers who are now looking almost to China as being kind of the economic global superpower of the future.
Just out of interest, which of the two Olympic ceremonies do you think is going to be better remembered?
I hope it's the Chinese. I hope actually people have been put off by Danny Boyle's announcements last week and actually are too embarrassed to actually tune into it, because I think really Britain is in a situation, it has been in the past, where it has been able to compete globally kind of economically. It has been an economic powerhouse. It gave birth to the Industrial Revolution. There's no reason why it can't do again, but I think it speaks to a lack of confidence and anxiety that they're effectively willing to hand over the baton or the Olympic torch to the Chinese now.
That was Patrick Hayes, a commentator for Spike magazine, saying he isn't too enthusiastic about Danny Boyle's plans for farmyard animals at the Olympic opening ceremony. I was also joined by Rod Wye from the foreign policy think tank Chatham House, Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College London, and over the line from Hong Kong by Andrew Leung, an independent China specialist. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update of what's making headlines around the world. Cameron met with the Dalai Lama. Beijing has ruled Tibet since 1950, considers the Dalai Lama a separatist and warns other countries against interfering in its domestic affairs. Chinese anger at foreign interference used to be easier to brush off, but now its defense spending grows by 12% a year and its economy by a recession-defying 8% this year. Territorial disputes with the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia and Taiwan across the South China Sea frequently flare up into standoffs, and the United States is currently pivoting towards the Asia-Pacific in what Beijing think tanks see as a containment policy. So, has China's growing power silenced Britain over the Dalai Lama's visit? How is China's rise perceived from Taiwan and the other countries with
UK and with Europe, especially at this moment when both China's economy and the European economy are not doing as well as they had once done?
I'd like to get opinions from the other speakers here on this issue, but maybe, Andrew, in Hong Kong, can you explain from maybe even as far back as 1950 how the Tibet situation came about and why it is so crucial from Beijing's point of view?
It went back very, very long time, way before communists took power. You've got to go back really to the Qing dynasty and beyond, because during the past, there was a lot of the linkages, but influence from Beijing, including certain periods where certain local senior officials, their appointment had to be sanctioned by the imperial court. So
a period of Chinese outrage. We have seen increasingly China taking sanctions of various sorts against the countries concerned, and then after a while, relations get back to normal.
And do you think there's anything changing in this dynamic now? For example, is the UK having to listen more to China because it has more economic weight? There have been a number of trade delegations from London travelling out to Beijing, and they've had their ministerial level meetings downgraded. Is the UK missing out on trade because we have to have our officials meeting the Dalai Lama?
I think probably not. I mean, China's sanctions are usually carefully targeted so that they hurt the pride of the country concerned, but don't hurt China's real interests. And China does have significant interests in continuing trade.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. China and Britain have been embroiled in a low-level diplomatic tussle this week over one of Beijing's perennial bugbears, the Dalai Lama. The exiled Tibetan Buddhist leader is visiting the UK, and China wants to ensure he doesn't get red carpet treatment. China even threatened to withdraw its pre-Olympic training camp from Leeds over the northern city hosting a speech from His Holiness. Chinese officials have snubbed British delegates during trips to Beijing since May, when Prime Minister David has territorial disputes. And what predictions can we make about the American pivot towards the region? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studios. I'm joined by Rod Wye from the foreign policy think tank Chatham House, Patrick Hayes, a commentator for Spite magazine, Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College London, and Andrew Leung, an independent China specialist over the line from Hong Kong. First of all, to you, Rod, in the studio, what do you make over the Dalai Lama's visit and the standoff between Beijing and London over this one?
Well, there's a common pattern to this. China regularly objects to any governments allowing the Dalai Lama to visit their country, and particularly it objects to meetings between politicians and the Dalai Lama. And there is